Senators whispered about his excesses, citizens gossiped about his scandals, and foreign envoys marveled at the strange ruler who dressed as a performer, demanded applause, and fancied himself not only an emperor but a living artist. But for Nero, none of that mattered as long as Poppaea stood by his side, her beauty reinforcing his image of divine grandeur. He wanted her not just as a wife, but as a symbol, a reflection of himself and his empire. Yet fate had a cruel twist in store. Poppaea, while pregnant with Nero's child, died suddenly. Some accounts suggest Nero struck her in a fit of rage, others hint at negligence, but whatever the truth, her death left him devastated. It was not the grief of an ordinary man, it was the despair of an emperor who believed he could control life itself, and when he found that he could not bring her back, he sought another way, to recreate her in flesh, even if it meant bending the boundaries of nature and morality. Thus begins one of the most chilling and disturbing episodes in Roman history where power, obsession, and delusion collide. It is here, in the wake of Poppaea's death, that Nero's grief transformed into madness, and where the tragic figure of a teenage boy named Sporus would soon be drawn into the emperor's dark design. The death of Poppaea Sabina in 65 C was a moment that shattered Nero's fragile world. Ancient sources differ on the exact cause of her demise, but all agree on one fact: her passing was sudden and violent. According to the historian Suetonius, Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant, causing her to collapse and die instantly. Tacitus, more restrained in his account, suggests her death may have been due to complications during childbirth, worsened by Nero's reckless behavior. Regardless of which version is true, the image of the young empress lying lifeless, her unborn child gone with her, left an indelible stain on Nero's reign. He had destroyed the very woman he professed to love most, but in his twisted mind, love and cruelty were never far apart. The same passion that had driven him to elevate Poppaea into the center of his universe had also consumed her in a single storm of violence. For most men, such an act would lead to regret, mourning, perhaps even a private descent into guilt. But Nero was not an ordinary man. He was an emperor who believed himself above ordinary boundaries, a living god whose whims shaped the destiny of millions. He did not respond to Poppaea's death with humble grief. Instead, he turned the tragedy into a performance. He ordered her body embalmed with spices and placed in the mausoleum of Augustus, granting her divine honors. Across Rome, statues and shrines appeared in her likeness, transforming her from a mortal woman into a goddess in the eyes of the empire. The Senate, ever eager to appease Nero, confirmed her deification. To the outside world, this was the ultimate act of devotion from a grieving husband. But behind the palace walls, Nero's grief was not peaceful. It was obsessive, dangerous, and deeply unsettling. Poppaea's absence created a void in Nero's psyche, one he could not bear to confront. For years, she had been the anchor of his affections, the reflection of his grandeur, and the symbol of beauty he paraded before the world. Now she was gone, and with her, the illusion of control Nero clung to so desperately. He wandered the palace halls in despair, calling out her name, unable to accept the finality of death. His court whispered of his breakdowns, his strange moods, his fixation on memories of her. Some accounts suggest he would dress statues in her clothing, surround himself with her portraits, and refuse to allow servants to speak of her in the past tense. For Nero, Poppaea was not dead. She was only waiting to be restored. It was this refusal to let go that soon led Nero down one of the darkest paths of his rule. He began to imagine that Poppaea could somehow live again, that her spirit could be captured in another vessel. Rome was a city where artifice and illusion were celebrated. Actors wore masks, performers transformed themselves into gods on stage, and beauty was often manufactured. Nero, who already considered himself a consummate artist, believed he too could recreate reality. If he could not bring Poppaea back to life, he would find someone to replace her so completely that the boundary between memory and reality would blur. This was not merely grief. It was obsession sharpened into delusion. As weeks turned into months, whispers began to circulate of the emperor's strange search. He sent out courtiers to scour Rome and beyond, looking for someone who resembled Poppaea in youth, grace, and beauty. The empire was vast, full of slaves, servants, and captives who could be molded into whatever form their master demanded. Eventually, Nero's gaze fell upon a young boy named Sporus. Barely in his teens, Sporus was said to bear a striking resemblance to Poppaea in his features, delicate, fair-skinned, with soft lines that mirrored the woman Nero could not forget. It was here in this chilling discovery that Nero's obsession found its outlet. Sporus would become more than a substitute. He would become the emperor's living canvas, shaped and transformed until he embodied Poppaea herself. But before that transformation could begin, Nero's court had to accept the unthinkable, that their emperor intended to turn a boy into the shadow of his dead wife. For those who lived within the palace, defiance was not an option. To question Nero's desires was to risk exile, torture, or death. And so in hushed tones and fearful glances, the machinery of imperial power turned to accommodate one man's madness. Rome would soon witness a spectacle that blurred the line between grief and cruelty, love and obsession, life and death. And in the middle of it all stood Sporus, a teenager whose fate had been sealed by the emperor's refusal to let go of his past. When Nero finally set his eyes on Sporus, it was as if his madness had found its answer. The boy was barely in his mid-teens, a fragile figure drawn unwillingly into the storm of imperial obsession. His resemblance to Poppaea was uncanny, at least to Nero's grieving mind. The delicate features, pale complexion, and youthful grace reminded him of the Empress he had lost. To others, this similarity may have seemed tenuous at best, but to Nero, desperate, delusional, and unwilling to accept death, it was enough. He convinced himself that Poppaea could live again through this boy, that by reshaping him, he could erase the unbearable void her death had left behind. What followed was one of the most disturbing transformations in Roman history. Nero ordered that Sporus be taken into his care, not as a servant or a courtier, but as a living vessel to be remade in the image of Poppaea. Ancient historians report that Nero commanded physicians to castrate the boy, removing his ability to grow into manhood and preserving the smooth, youthful softness of his body. It was an act of cruelty cloaked in obsession, a procedure that stripped Sporus of his identity and future. Castration in the Roman world was not unheard of. Slaves and singers were sometimes subjected to it, but to do so with the intention of recreating a dead woman was a grotesque distortion of power. For Sporus, it was the beginning of a life lived not as himself, but as someone else's ghost. Once the physical transformation was done, Nero began to clothe Sporus in the garments of Poppaea. He dressed him in silks and jewels, painted his face with cosmetics, and draped him in the regal attire of an empress. He even called Sporus by Poppaea's name in private, blurring the line between memory and reality until the boy was no longer seen as an individual, but as a vessel for Nero's fantasy. To the emperor, this was not cruelty. In his mind, he had conquered death by bringing back the woman he adored. But to the world around him, it was a chilling spectacle of manipulation and delusion. Nero's obsession did not stop at the walls of the palace. In one of the most shocking acts recorded by Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Nero went so far as to marry Sporus in a public ceremony. Draped in a bridal veil, Sporus was led through a mock wedding where Nero played the role of the groom and the boy, stripped of his identity, was forced into the role of the bride. The court was compelled to attend, applauding as though this bizarre parody of matrimony was legitimate. In Rome's streets, whispers spread of the emperor's madness. The most powerful man in the world had turned a teenage boy into the replica of his dead wife and taken him as his spouse. For Nero, this was not humiliation. It was the ultimate performance, a drama in which he controlled the script, the stage, and the actors. The cruelty of this arrangement extended far beyond the ceremony itself. Sporus was paraded alongside Nero at public events, presented as the Empress reborn. Wherever the emperor went, Sporus followed, a living reminder of the grotesque lengths to which Nero would go to satisfy his obsession. He was forced to play the role of a woman, to smile and bow, as though he were not a victim, but a participant in the charade. For the Roman elite, this was deeply unsettling. Some mocked Nero behind closed doors, others feared the implications of such unchecked behavior, but none dared to openly oppose him. To challenge the emperor's fantasy was to risk one's life. What makes this story even more disturbing is the way it exposes the extremes of imperial power. For Nero, the empire itself was his stage, and its people were merely an audience for his self-indulgent tragedy. By remaking Sporus into Poppaea, he demonstrated not only his obsession but also his belief that nothing, not death, not morality, not even human identity, could limit his will. He had already killed his mother, banished rivals, and silenced critics. Now he had reshaped another human being into a symbol of his delusion. Sporus's tragedy lay not only in the suffering inflicted upon him, but in the way his individuality was erased, replaced by the ghost of a woman long gone. Thus the boy became a prisoner in the emperor's fantasy, caught between survival and submission. For Nero, the transformation was proof of his godlike power, a defiance of nature itself. For Rome, it was a reminder that their ruler's grief had become a weapon, turning a teenager into a grotesque reflection of love twisted into obsession. And for history, it remains one of the clearest windows into the darkness of absolute power, the moment when an emperor tried to resurrect the dead not through prayer or memory, but through cruelty and control. Once Sporus had been transformed into the living shadow of Poppaea, his life was no longer his own. What might have been a private madness confined to Nero's palace quickly became a public performance for the entire empire. Nero was never content to grieve in silence. Every part of his life was a stage, and every Roman, whether senator or slave, was his audience. Sporus, draped in silk robes and adorned with jewels, became the centerpiece of that performance. Wherever Nero went, the boy followed, not as himself, but as a Poppaea reborn. To see them together was to witness a grotesque masquerade, the emperor walking proudly with his new bride, while the boy beside him bore the forced smile of someone trapped in a nightmare he could not escape. Nero insisted on displaying Sporus as his empress at official events. At banquets, the boy was seated beside him, veiled as a Roman bride, his soft features painted to enhance the illusion. At festivals and games, Sporus stood in the imperial box, visible to thousands of Roman citizens who whispered in disbelief at the sight. Some in the crowd laughed behind their hands, others were horrified, but no one dared voice their contempt openly. The emperor's will was law, and to mock his wife, even a mockery as absurd as this, was to invite swift and brutal punishment. Rome, which had tolerated extravagance and scandal before, was now forced to accept a spectacle that bordered on madness. The most infamous episode came when Nero staged a mock wedding for Sporus in front of the public. Wearing the bridal veil, Sporus was led through the ritual as though he were a virgin maiden, while Nero played the devoted groom. Priests were called, dowries were offered, and the union was sealed as if it were a sacred Roman marriage. For Nero, this ceremony was not a parody but a statement. He had conquered fate itself by marrying Poppaea once again, even if it meant forcing a boy into her likeness. For Sporus, it was another humiliation, another erasure of his identity. His name, his body, his future, all had been taken from him, and in their place was the ghost of a woman whose memory he had been forced to inhabit. Life in the palace was no less oppressive. Sporus was required to respond as Poppaea would have, to play the part of the elegant empress even in private moments. Nero, who saw himself as both artist and god, directed every detail of this performance. He demanded affection, obedience, and submission. The boy had no choice but to comply, for refusal meant death, or worse. For Nero, Sporus was not a person but a canvas, a tool to soothe his grief and inflate his vanity. The emperor lavished him with gifts, fine clothing, and jewels, but these were chains disguised as luxuries. They reminded Sporus that his role was not one of freedom but of servitude, bound to Nero's delusion. Outside the palace, Rome was both fascinated and unsettled. The Senate, already weary of Nero's excesses, saw in this bizarre relationship further proof of his instability. Ordinary citizens, too, gossiped about the emperor who had married a boy and paraded him as his wife. Yet fear kept most tongues still. Nero's spies were everywhere, and whispers of dissent could end in imprisonment or execution. To survive under such a regime meant playing along, laughing when the emperor demanded laughter, cheering when he expected applause, and pretending that this strange parody of marriage was something noble rather than grotesque. In truth, Sporus's presence symbolized more than just Nero's madness. It symbolized Rome's helplessness under absolute power. Here was a teenager, stripped of his humanity, forced to embody the dead empress because the emperor willed it, and no one could stop it. The very institutions meant to guide and check imperial power, the Senate, the courts, the traditions of Rome, were powerless before Nero's obsession. Sporus's humiliation was, in many ways, the humiliation of Rome itself, a reminder that when one man holds unchecked authority, even the boundaries of life, death, and identity can be broken. For Sporus, every day was survival. He lived not as himself, but as a ghost carrying the unbearable weight of Nero's obsession. Each public appearance was a performance he could not escape, each banquet a reminder that his life was no longer his own. And as Nero's behavior grew more erratic, his paranoia deepening, his cruelty escalating, the boy must have known that his fate, like so many others who lived too close to the emperor, hung by a fragile thread. As the years passed, Nero's obsession with Sporus grew more grotesque, while his grip on reality weakened. What began as grief over Poppaea's death had twisted into a spectacle of power and delusion that consumed not only the boy's life but the dignity of the Roman Empire itself. For Nero, Sporus was no longer simply a replacement for his lost wife. He was a trophy of control, proof that the emperor's will could defy nature itself. Yet beneath the surface of luxury, jewels, and forced adoration, Sporus lived a life of silent torment, trapped in a role from which there was no escape. Nero's court had grown used to scandal, but even among the decadent elite of Rome, whispers about Sporus continued. Some nobles pitied the boy, seeing in him the reflection of their own helplessness under imperial tyranny. Others laughed cruelly at the absurdity of it all, an emperor who had turned a teenager into his bride. Yet whether whispered in sympathy or scorn, all conversation ended the same way, silence born of fear. For Nero was no longer the charming young ruler he had once seemed. He was a man consumed by paranoia, capable of sudden and violent cruelty toward anyone he suspected of betrayal. Outside the palace walls, Rome itself began to fracture. Fires had ravaged the city, and many believed Nero himself had started them to clear land for his grand architectural projects, including the opulent Domus Aurea, or Golden House. He blamed the Christians, ordering brutal persecutions that shocked even hardened Romans, but the suspicions lingered. Meanwhile, the provinces grew restless, and revolts began to stir in distant corners of the empire. The emperor, who once presented himself as an artist and performer, now faced a world crumbling beneath the weight of his misrule. And through it all, Sporus was there, forced to play the part of Poppaea, to stand by Nero's side as Rome itself began to turn against its ruler. For Sporus, the role was not merely humiliating, it was terrifying. Every glance, every smile, every gesture had to be perfect, for the emperor's moods shifted like storms. One moment, Nero would shower him with gifts and praise, calling him his beloved Poppaea returned to life. The next, he might explode in rage at some imagined slight, reminding the boy that his existence was precarious. Sporus had no family to protect him, no allies in the court strong enough to intervene. His survival depended entirely on playing a part he never asked for, living as the ghost of a woman he had never been. The cruelest irony was that Nero seemed to believe this was love. In his mind, he was honoring Poppaea by keeping her spirit alive, and Sporus was the vessel chosen for that honor. Yet what Nero called love was, in truth, domination, the complete erasure of another's identity for the sake of his own fantasy. Sporus's suffering was invisible to him, or perhaps worse, irrelevant. To the emperor, the boy's pain was simply the cost of sustaining the illusion that Poppaea had never truly left him. As Nero's paranoia deepened, he surrounded himself with fewer and fewer trusted advisors. Those who remained were either sycophants who fed his delusions or terrified servants who obeyed without question. Seneca, his once wise tutor, was gone, forced to take his own life. His generals grew restless, his allies thinner. And yet, through every decline, Nero clung to Sporus as though the boy's presence could shield him from the empire's discontent. It was as if by keeping Poppaea alive through Sporus, he could also keep his reign alive, an emperor and his empress, untouchable, eternal. But eternity was slipping away. Rumors of rebellion echoed through the empire, and even in Rome, patience was running thin. Senators plotted in secret, generals questioned their loyalty, and the people who had once cheered Nero now began to curse his name. The theater, music, and pageantry could no longer distract them from hunger, destruction, and the emperor's bizarre behavior. For Sporus, this shifting tide was both a faint glimmer of hope and a source of dread. If Nero fell, what would become of him? Would freedom finally come, or would he be cast aside, another casualty of Rome's turbulent politics? In many ways, Sporus had become a symbol of Rome itself, beautiful on the surface, draped in silks and jewels, but hollowed out by the cruelty of one man's ambition. His fate, like that of the empire, depended on Nero's crumbling grasp on power. And as the emperor's enemies closed in, the boy who had been forced into the role of a dead empress stood on the edge of yet another transformation, uncertain whether survival would mean liberation or a new kind of captivity. By the late 60s CE, the shimmering illusion Nero had built around himself began to collapse. The empire that once bowed to his extravagance now stirred with rebellion, and the Senate that once flattered him in silence now whispered of betrayal. The emperor, who had fancied himself an artist, a god, and even a husband to the ghost of Poppaea, was finally forced to confront reality. Yet even as Rome turned against him, Nero clung desperately to his fantasies, dragging Sporus deeper into his unraveling world. Revolts broke out in Gaul, Spain, and Africa, led by generals who no longer recognized Nero's authority. The once loyal Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, began to desert him. The Senate declared him a public enemy, stripping him of the titles he had used as armor. For an emperor who had lived his entire life on the stage of power, the humiliation was unbearable. He who once commanded the applause of thousands was now reduced to a fugitive, hiding from the wrath of his own people. Throughout this descent, Sporus remained by his side. To Nero, the boy was still Poppaea, his only comfort, the fragile illusion of love in a world crumbling around him. As he prepared to flee Rome, Nero took Sporus with him, not as a servant, but as though he were the loyal empress sharing his exile. Ancient accounts describe Nero calling Sporus as a bride even in these desperate days, holding on to the delusion that she, through him, was still with him, still loyal, even as the empire turned away. The emperor's final days were filled with paranoia and despair. He wandered the gardens of his villa, begging for a place to hide, clutching at Sporus as though the boy's presence could ward off the inevitable. He asked friends to dig him a grave in advance, to prepare the shroud, even to rehearse his own death. But when the moment came, Nero, who had ordered countless others to die, could not bring himself to take his own life. "Oh, what an artist dies in me," he famously lamented, mourning not the empire he had destroyed, but the image of himself as a performer denied his final act. It was only with the help of a loyal servant that Nero finally met his end in 68 CE, stabbing himself in the throat as soldiers closed in. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of Rome's chaotic year of the four emperors. For Rome, it was a turning point. For Sporus, it was the collapse of the twisted world that had defined his existence. Yet freedom did not come with Nero's death. Instead, Sporus found himself passed from one powerful man to another, each treating him as though he were still the Empress Nero had created. Otho, who briefly seized the throne and had once been Poppaea's husband, took Sporus into his household, continuing the grotesque charade. Even after Otho's downfall, Vitellius, his rival, claimed Sporus for himself. To them, the boy was not an individual but a symbol, Nero's strange legacy, a living reminder of the emperor's madness and Rome's complicity in it. For Sporus, this was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Nero was gone, yet his shadow remained, and the boy could not escape it. His name was forever tied to the emperor's obsession, his body forever marked by the transformation he had been forced to endure. Wherever he went, he carried the ghost of Poppaea with him, unable to reclaim the life or identity that had been stolen. In this way, Sporus's tragedy did not end with Nero's death. It lingered long after, woven into the fabric of Roman history as a reminder of how power, when unchecked, can consume not only empires but the very souls of those trapped within them. Nero had fallen, but the scars he left on Sporus remained, a living testimony to the dangers of obsession, cruelty, and the madness of absolute rule. After Nero's dramatic suicide, many in Rome believed the nightmare was over. The tyrant who had burned his city, mocked tradition, and twisted grief into grotesque obsession was gone. Yet for Sporus, Nero's death was not liberation. It was the beginning of another torment. The boy who had been forced into the role of Poppaea Sabina remained trapped in the identity that had been imposed upon him. His fate was no longer tied to Nero alone, but to the political chaos that followed. Almost immediately, Sporus was absorbed into the household of Otho, the man who had once been Poppaea's husband before Nero had taken her. Otho's motives were complex. Perhaps he felt some bitter irony in possessing the reborn version of the woman he had lost, or perhaps he simply continued the grotesque legacy Nero had started. Whatever the reason, Sporus's role as Poppaea did not end. Instead, he was paraded once again not as himself, but as a living echo of a woman whose shadow still haunted Rome. When Otho's brief reign collapsed and Vitellius rose to power, Sporus was passed on yet again. To Vitellius, Sporus was little more than a curiosity, an ornament of power, and a tool for spectacle. Ancient sources claim Vitellius planned to humiliate him in the cruelest way possible, to dress him as a woman once more and parade him before the Roman public in a degrading performance that would mock both Sporus and the memory of Nero. For a boy who had endured years of being forced into the role of Poppaea, the prospect of another public humiliation was unbearable. And so, faced with no escape, Sporus chose death over degradation. According to Cassius Dio, he took his own life rather than submit to Vitellius's plans. In doing so, he reclaimed the only power left to him, the ability to decide the terms of his final act. It was a tragic end for someone who had been robbed of agency for so long. Sporus's suicide marked the conclusion of a life defined not by his own choices, but by the obsessions of powerful men. History remembers him not as an individual in his own right, but as Nero's bride, the boy transformed into a woman against his will. Yet behind that cruel label was a human being whose suffering embodied the darker truths of absolute power. Sporus was a victim of a system where emperors were treated as gods, their whims unchecked by law or morality. His life illustrates how far tyranny could reach, not only in wars and politics, but in the most intimate corners of identity and selfhood. The story of Nero and Sporus remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Roman history, not only because of its strangeness, but because of what it reveals about the dangers of unchecked authority. Nero's obsession blurred the boundaries between love and cruelty, grief and madness, performance and reality. In his desperate attempt to resurrect Poppaea, he destroyed Sporus's life, turning a teenager into a shadow, a mask, a ghost. Rome, complicit in silence, allowed the charade to continue, proof that fear can make even the most powerful society turn away from injustice when it comes from the top. In the end, Sporus's tragedy outlived Nero. He became a symbol of how individuals could be erased by the desires of rulers, how personal grief could become political cruelty, and how unchecked power leaves devastation in its wake. His name surfaces in history only through the words of Roman historians, yet his suffering still echoes as a warning. Love twisted into obsession, power divorced from responsibility, and the crushing silence of those who watch and do nothing. These are not merely lessons of Rome, but truths that resound across every age. Thus, the tale of Sporus is more than a bizarre footnote in the reign of Nero. It is a reminder that beneath the grandeur of empire and the glitter of power, the human cost of tyranny is borne by the most vulnerable. And while emperors rise and fall, it is often their victims, like the boy forced to live as a dead woman, who carry the heaviest burdens their